It was supposed to be the safest bet in the world. The Bank of England, the world's oldest central bank, standing behind the pound sterling. The exchange rate mechanism of the European monetary system, a cage of iron rules designed to keep currencies locked together. And on one side sat the entire German Bundesbank, the most feared inflation-fighting institution in history. On the other side sat a single man with a piece of paper. It is not what they taught you in school. The story of Black Wednesday, September 16, 1992, is not a story about currency speculators winning a bet. It is a forensic document of what happens when political vanity collides with arithmetic. When a government decides that a number on a chart is more important than the living economy beneath it. And when one memo, written by a mid-level official, becomes the detonator. The official story goes like this. The British pound was forced out of the ERM because George Soros broke the Bank of England, a hedge fund manager against a central bank. David versus Goliath, except David won. It makes a good headline. It makes terrible history. Because the real collapse began months before Soros placed a single trade. It began in a quiet office at the Treasury with a man named Sir Nigel Wicks, the second permanent secretary. And it began with a memo he wrote that nobody wanted to read. The memo was titled, with the exquisite blandness of the British Civil Service, ERM Contingency Planning. Dated August 20th, 1992, 27 days before the crash. It contained one central argument. The pound's peg to the Deutschmark at 2.95 dm was unsustainable. The arithmetic was simple. British inflation was running at 3.7%. German inflation, driven by reunification spending, was at 4.2%. To defend the peg, the UK would need to raise interest rates to German levels, above 9%. But the British economy was already in a housing crash. Unemployment had just hit 2.8 million. Raising rates to 10% would kill what was left. Wicks wrote it down. He wrote that the only rational option was to prepare for a managed exit. He wrote that the cost of staying in the ERM would soon exceed the cost of leaving. He wrote that the political damage of a devaluation would be less than the economic damage of defending the peg at all costs. That memo was stamped confidential and circulated to exactly 6 people. The Chancellor, Norman Lamont. The Prime Minister, John Major. The Governor of the Bank of England, Robin Lee Pemberton. And 3 senior Treasury officials. It was dismissed. Wicks was told, politely, to stop being alarmist. The Prime Minister had staked his entire political identity on the ERM. He had called it the centerpiece of our anti-inflation strategy. To admit the peg was wrong was to admit that his central economic policy was a mistake. And in Westminster, that was unacceptable. So the memo sat in a filing cabinet while the arithmetic got worse. On September 3, 1992, German Bundesbank President Helmut Schlesinger gave a speech in Munich. He did not mention the pound by name. He did not need to. He said that the current exchange rate parities in the ERM require realignment for some currencies. In the language of central bankers, that was a nuclear launch code. The market heard it. The pound began to slide. On September 10th, the Bundesbank's own internal research division circulated a paper. It concluded that the pound was overvalued by at least 10% against the Deutschmark. That paper was leaked to the Financial Times on September 11th. By September 14th, the pound had lost 3 pfennigs in 3 days. And still the British government did nothing. Because to act on the memo, to admit that Sir Nigel Wicks had been right, would require the Prime Minister to say that his policy had failed. And John Major would not do it. He would not admit that the centerpiece was a lie. So instead, they borrowed. On Monday, September 14th, the Bank of England borrowed $5 billion from the Bundesbank to intervene in the currency markets. They spent it buying pounds, trying to prop up the exchange rate. It lasted about 4 hours. On Tuesday, September 15th, they spent another $4 billion. The pound fell again. On Wednesday, September 16th, at 6 a.m., the Bank of England raised interest rates from 10% to 12%. The pound rose for exactly 30 minutes. Then it fell. At 11 a.m., they raised rates again to 15%. The highest rate in the United Kingdom since the oil crisis of 1975. Emergency rates. Panic rates. And the market laughed. Because the arithmetic was the arithmetic. A 15% interest rate would destroy the housing market, crush business lending, and trigger a wave of defaults that would make the early 80s recession look like a mild cold. The market knew it. The Bank of England knew it. The Prime Minister knew it. But he would not admit it. At 4 p.m., Le Monde announced that the UK was suspending its membership of the ERM. The pound immediately fell to 2.70 DM, then to 2.65. Within a week, it was trading at 2.50. A 15% devaluation in 7 days. The cost to the British taxpayer, £3.3 billion in reserves spent defending the peg. All of it gone. Wiped out. And the memo that predicted it? Classified for 25 years. Supporters of the ERM will say that the system was not the problem. They will say that the UK entered at the wrong rate, 2.95 DM, and that a lower entry would have worked. They will say that the Bundesbank should have cut German rates to help. They will say that it was never really tried properly. But the memo tells a different story. The memo says the problem was not the rate. The problem was the system itself. A fixed exchange rate regime that requires a country to surrender monetary sovereignty. To let Frankfurt decide when your economy can grow. To let the Bundesbank decide how that is the objection. And it has a surface-level reasonableness. The ERM was designed to create stability, after all. To prevent the competitive devaluations that had crippled European trade in the 1970s. To force discipline on governments that printed money to buy elections. In principle, it was a good idea. In practice, it required something no political system can provide, honesty about arithmetic. Because the real problem was never the entry rate. The real problem was that the ERM demanded a government choose between two things: the credibility of its exchange rate and the health of its domestic economy. And when those two things diverged, the government had to lie to itself. Britain in 1992 was not Germany. British house prices had fallen 20% from their 1989 peak. Mortgage arrears had tripled. Personal bankruptcies were at a record high. The manufacturing sector was shrinking. And the government was telling the country that the answer was higher interest rates. You cannot solve a housing crash with higher interest rates. You cannot fix falling wages with a stronger currency. And you cannot maintain a fixed exchange rate when the market knows your numbers do not add up. The memo from Sir Nigel Wicks understood this. It understood that the ERM was not a mechanism for stability. It was a mechanism for forcing countries to adopt German monetary policy, regardless of whether it fit their economy. And when it did not fit, the mechanism would break. The question was, who would break first? The answer came on September 16, 1992, at 7:30 a.m., when George Soros' Quantum Fund began selling pounds. They sold $500 million in the first hour. By 10 a.m., they had sold $1.5 billion. By noon, they had sold $3 billion. And they were not alone. Every hedge fund, every pension fund, every bank in London was selling the pound. Because the memo had been right and nobody had acted on it. The Bank of England spent $1 billion in the first 30 minutes of trading. It was like throwing cups of water into the ocean. The tide did not notice. By 1 p.m., the bank had spent $5 billion of its $10 billion war chest. The pound was still falling. By 3 p.m., they had spent $7 billion. By 4 p.m., they had spent $9 billion. And then they stopped, because there was nothing left to spend. The currency reserves of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland had been drained in a single day. Not by a speculator, not by a conspiracy, by arithmetic. The memo had predicted this. It had been ignored, and the cost of that ignorance was measured not in billions of pounds, but in the lives of the people who lost their homes, their jobs, their savings, in the recession that followed. Because the crash of 1992 did not end on Black Wednesday. That was just the day the bill came due. The recession that followed Black Wednesday was not caused by the devaluation. It was caused by the years of defending the peg that came before it. The ERM years, from October 1990 to September 1992, were not a period of stability. They were a period of slow economic asphyxiation. Interest rates stayed above 10% for 18 consecutive months. Mortgage payments for the average British family rose by £240 a month. In 1991 alone, 75,000 homes were repossessed. That is one home every 7 minutes. Not a statistic. A door being closed for the last time. The housing market did not just decline. It collapsed. Prices fell so far that by 1993, 1 in 6 homeowners in the UK had negative equity. They owed more on their mortgage than their house was worth. They could not sell. They could not move. They were trapped in a house that was bleeding value, paying interest rates that were bleeding income, and being told by the government that this was the price of credibility. Credibility for what? The ERM was supposed to bring down inflation. It did. Inflation fell from 9.5% in 1990 to 3.6% in 1992. But the mechanism was not productivity or growth. The mechanism was destruction. High interest rates crushed demand. Crushed demand meant fewer jobs. Fewer jobs meant lower wages. Lower wages meant less spending. And less spending meant falling prices. It worked. The inflation rate fell. So did the economy. GDP contracted by 1.4% in 1991 and another 0.5% in 1992. The recession was deeper and longer than the one that followed the 2008 financial crisis, measured by the peak to trough decline in output. And it was all for nothing. Because on September 16, 1992, the peg broke anyway. Every month of pain, every home repossessed, every job lost, was a payment for a policy that failed. The pound devalued. Inflation stayed low anyway. The economy began to recover. But the people who lost their homes in 1991 did not get them back. The memo understood this. It understood that the cost of defending the peg was front-loaded and irreversible, while the benefit was hypothetical and delayed. It understood that you cannot ask a country to suffer today for a promise that may not hold tomorrow. And it understood that the promise would not hold, because the arithmetic was wrong. Sir Nigel Wicks wrote it all down. He wrote that the UK should prepare an exit strategy. He wrote that the exit should be orderly, managed, and announced in advance to minimize market disruption. He wrote that the government should tell the truth. The peg was unsustainable, the cost was too high, and the only rational choice was to leave. They did not listen. They chose to lie. And when the lie broke, it broke hard. The lie broke on September 16th, but the pieces did not stop falling for years. Because what Black Wednesday revealed was not just a failed exchange rate policy. It revealed a deeper fracture in the architecture of power itself. Consider who made the decision to enter the ERM. Margaret Thatcher. The same Margaret Thatcher who had built her entire political career on the principle of national sovereignty. The same woman who had fought the European community for every pound of the British budget rebate. And yet, in October 1990, she allowed her Chancellor, John Major, to take the pound into a system that handed control of British interest rates to the Bundesbank. Why? Because she was politically weakened. The poll tax riots had destroyed her authority. Her own party was plotting against her. She needed a policy victory, and the ERM was sold to her as the path to low inflation without the pain of domestic austerity. A magic solution. A way to outsource discipline to Frankfurt. It was a delusion, and she knew it. In her memoirs, published 3 years later, she called the ERM a halfway house and a recipe for instability. But by the time she wrote those words, the damage was done. John Major inherited the policy when he became Prime Minister in November 1990. He did not inherit it reluctantly. He believed in it. He had negotiated the entry terms. He had staked his reputation on the 2.95 DM rate. And when the arithmetic turned against him, he could not bring himself to admit that his own creation was failing. This is the pattern that repeats. Not the specific numbers, but the psychology. A leader commits to a policy. The policy shows early signs of failure. The leader doubles down to protect his credibility. The doubling down makes the eventual failure more catastrophic. And the people who pay the price are never the ones who made the decision. In 1992, the people who paid the price were the 2.8 million unemployed, the 75,000 families who lost their homes, the small business owners who went bankrupt because their borrowing costs tripled, the young couples who could not get a mortgage because banks had stopped lending. John Major remained Prime Minister for another 5 years. He lost the 1997 election, but he was not ruined. He received a knighthood. He sits in the House of Lords. He writes books. Sir Nigel Wicks, the man who wrote the memo that told the truth, retired from the civil service in 1998. He was also knighted. He died in 2021, largely forgotten by the public. His memo was declassified in 2017, 25 years after it was written. By then, the story of Black Wednesday had already been rewritten as the story of George Soros breaking the Bank of England. The memo tells a different story. It tells the story of a government that knew the truth and chose not to act. It tells the story of a system that punished honesty and rewarded denial. And it tells the story of what happens when political vanity is allowed to override arithmetic. History does not repeat, but if you do not understand it, it will crush you all the same. What makes the Wicks memo so devastating is not that it predicted the crash. Anyone could predict the crash by September 1992. The numbers were public. The German interest rate was 8.5%. The British base rate was 10%. The spread between them was bleeding the Treasury dry. Every analyst in London could do that math. What makes the memo devastating is that it predicted the psychology. Wicks understood that the ERM was not a technical mechanism. It was a political trap. Once a government entered the system, leaving became an admission of failure. And because leaving was an admission of failure, the government would delay leaving until the cost of staying became unbearable, by which point the cost of leaving would be catastrophic. He wrote it down. He sent it up the chain. And the chain chose not to read it, because reading it would have required action. And action would have required John Major to stand up in the House of Commons and say, "We made a mistake. The policy I championed is not working. We need to change course." He could not do it. Not because he was stupid, not because he was corrupt, but because the system punished that kind of honesty. In Westminster, in 1992, admitting a mistake was political suicide. Doubling down on a mistake was statesmanship. And so the mistake was doubled down until it broke. The same psychology operates everywhere. It operates in corporate boardrooms where failed strategies are funded for years because the CEO who launched them cannot admit failure. It operates in military commands where generals feed more troops into losing battles because pulling back would tarnish their record. It operates in personal finance, where investors hold collapsing stocks because selling would mean admitting they were wrong. The ERM was just a particularly clean example. The numbers were clear. The memo was written. The decision was made. And the cost was £3.3 billion in reserves, a 15% devaluation, and a recession that lasted 2 more years. If Sir Nigel Wicks had been listened to, the exit would have been managed. The pound would have been devalued by 5 or 6% in an orderly adjustment. The reserves would have been preserved. The recession would have been shallower. The housing crash would have been less severe. Thousands of families would have kept their homes. But he was not listened to, because listening would have required someone powerful to say they were wrong. And that is the one thing the system cannot tolerate. So the memo sat in a file. The arithmetic got worse. And on September 16, 1992, the arithmetic won. The arithmetic won. But the story did not end there. Because Black Wednesday was not a single event. It was a template, a dress rehearsal for every currency crisis that followed. Look at the Asian financial crisis of 1997. Thailand had pegged the baht to the US dollar. The peg was unsustainable. Thai exports were losing competitiveness. The current account deficit was 8% of GDP. The central bank knew it. The finance ministry knew it. But the government had borrowed heavily in dollars, and devaluation would have crushed the banks. So they delayed. They spent $32 billion of reserves defending the peg. They raised interest rates to 20%. They lied to the IMF. And on July 2, 1997, the baht collapsed. The crisis spread to Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia. Entire economies were destroyed. The same psychology. The same delay. The same catastrophic end. Look at Argentina in 2001. The peso was pegged 1-to-1 to the US dollar. It was the cornerstone of the country's economic policy. The government had promised never to devalue. And when the peg became unsustainable, because the dollar was rising and Argentine exports were dying, the government could not bring itself to break the promise. So they borrowed. They spent reserves. They imposed capital controls. They froze bank accounts. They caused a depression. And then, in January 2002, the peg broke anyway. The peso lost 75% of its value in 3 months. The unemployment rate hit 25%. The country defaulted on its debt. The same pattern. The same denial. The same arithmetic. The Wicks memo is not a historical artifact. It is a living document. Because the mechanism it describes, political denial in the face of economic arithmetic, has never been fixed. It has only been refined. Today, the same mechanism operates in different forms. Countries with fixed exchange rates still delay devaluation until the crisis is catastrophic. Central banks still raise interest rates to defend currencies that cannot be defended. Governments still borrow in foreign currencies and pretend the exchange rate risk does not exist. The names change. The numbers change. But the pattern is the same. A memo is written. The memo is ignored. The arithmetic catches up. And the people who wrote the memo are forgotten, while the people who ignored it are promoted. Sir Nigel Wicks died in 2021. His obituary in the Financial Times mentioned the memo. It mentioned that he had been right. It mentioned that nobody listened. And then the world moved on to the next crisis, the next memo, the next ignored warning. Because that is the real lesson of Black Wednesday. Not that George Soros broke the Bank of England, but that the Bank of England broke itself. And it did it because the system is designed to ignore the arithmetic until the arithmetic becomes a catastrophe. The catastrophe of Black Wednesday cost £3.3 billion in reserves, a 15% devaluation, and 2 more years of recession. But it also cost something that cannot be measured in pounds: the trust that the people who run the system know what they are doing. Because they do not. They are not evil. They are not stupid. They are trapped in the same psychology that traps every human being who has ever made a public commitment and refused to walk away. The difference is that when a politician refuses to walk away, the cost is not measured in embarrassment. It is measured in homes, jobs, and lives. Sir Nigel Wicks understood this. He wrote it down. He sent it up the chain. And the chain chose not to read it, because reading it would have required a powerful person to say they were wrong. And that is the one thing the system cannot tolerate. So the memo sat in a filing cabinet for 25 years. When it was finally declassified in 2017, the journalists who read it nodded their heads and said, "Yes, of course, we knew." But knowing is not the same as acting. And acting is the only thing that matters. The pound survived. The British economy recovered. By 1997, the housing market had stabilized. By 2000, unemployment was below 5% again. The country moved on. The people who lost their homes in 1991 did not get them back. The people who lost their jobs in 1992 did not get those years back. The damage was permanent, even if the economy eventually healed. And the lesson? The lesson is that the next crisis is already being ignored. Somewhere, right now, a civil servant is writing a memo that predicts a collapse. That memo is being circulated. It is being read by people who know it is correct. And it is being filed away because acting on it would require someone powerful to admit they were wrong. The names will change. The numbers will change. The mechanism will not. Because the mechanism is not economic. It is psychological. It is the refusal to admit that the policy you championed is failing. It is the unwillingness to walk away from a public commitment. It is the quiet, steady, rational decision to delay the pain until the pain becomes unbearable. And when the pain becomes unbearable, the memo will be declassified. The journalists will write their articles. The historians will nod their heads. And the next crisis will begin. If this gave you a new perspective on what really happened in 1992, hit subscribe. The Collapse Ledger. History has the answers. I will show you where to look.